Labor unions in the Gilded Age faced an uphill struggle. This was a time when, for the most part, management held the upper hand. Working conditions in factories were pretty grim. The workday was 10 to 12 hours, 6 days a week. That was typical. And in many cases, especially in the textile or garment industry, there was a lot of piecework. That meant that workers would be paid not by the hour or by the day, but by each piece that they completed. For example, sewing a shirt would be worth so much money. This was usually a pretty difficult way to make a decent living because the rates for each piece were low and the amount of hours worked was tremendous, was huge. We've already talked about de-skilling earlier in the course. Just to do a quick review, this was a time when the task of manufacturing things was broken down into many different parts so that each part required very little training and skill. If one person had to build something from scratch, that required a lot of craftsmanship. But if you could break the process down, then you could hire people without paying them so much. And this was a common practice through much of the 19th century. There were other factors that drove wages down. One was immigration through the simple law of supply and demand. Just as goods, manufactured goods, are subject to that law, labor is subject to it also. The more workers, and therefore the greater the supply of labor, the lower the price is for that labor, or to put another way, the lower the wages will be. Also, when there was a depression in agriculture, a lot of people left the countryside and came to the cities, and that also tended to depress wages. Frederick W. Taylor was the leading example of what today we would call industrial psychology. He was a favorite of Henry Ford, and he published a book called The Principles of Scientific Management. But he was especially known for conducting studies of workers operating in the factory. He would examine in great detail, using stopwatches and all sorts of record keeping, how they moved to accomplish certain things. If by having to get a part from a bin required them to get up and walk 3 steps and then walk back, that might consume 3 seconds. Well, if he could move the bin and somehow reorganize the workplace, then they might be able to do that in 1 second. Basically, this is seeing workers as machines and trying to get as much labor out of them as possible. Needless to say, workers did not like this approach at all. More on factory working conditions. There was no government help for poor people, at least federal government, and very minimal help on the local government level. There was no minimum wage law. That didn't happen until Franklin Roosevelt's administration. There was no unemployment insurance. If you lost your job, you were out of luck. Your income stopped immediately. No disability insurance. If you were injured on the job, that's tough. And along with this, there was something called the fellow servant doctrine, which said that if your injury was the fault of another employee of your company, then the company was not responsible because it wasn't their fault, it was another employee's fault. In a famous case, a worker was seriously injured in a train derailment caused by another worker throwing a switch the wrong way, and the company didn't have any responsibility to that injured worker. That is not true today, by the way. There's no such thing as health insurance. There were no old age pensions. There was no Social Security. Uh, Employees were pretty much left on their own, and the most common time of life for poverty was old age. There was no life insurance. If something happened to you, your family would not be provided for. Even more on factory conditions. Child labor was very common. Almost 20% of children between the ages of 10 and 16 were employed. Some as young as 6 or 7 were also. And this meant, of course, that they weren't going to school or weren't going for very long. Uh, this is related to the ideology of social Darwinism, which we've already looked at, that society is evolving to become better, that the fittest will survive and prosper and the weak will not, and that poverty is caused by personal weakness. So if you're poor, it's your fault, in other words. Um, there was also the fear that any kind of relief or charity to the poor would encourage them to be idle. One approach to this is to make sure that whatever charity they gave would be less than the lowest paying job out there. And of course, those low paying jobs were really not enough to sustain a decent life. Um, there were often fires in factories, the most notorious being the Triangle Shirtwaist fire in 1911, which we'll look at a bit later in the course. There were all kinds of accidents. In the Gilded Age, an average of 35,000 workers a year died in workplace accidents. Um, and the union movement was generally weak. So this was a very, very difficult time to be a blue-collar worker. Uh, the first of the unions after the Civil War was called the National Labor Union, founded the year after the end of the war, but it died really in the Depression of 1873, also known as the Panic of 1873. It died simply because there was so much unemployment that robbed workers of their bargaining power. Employers could just say, well, all right, if you don't like your wages, if you don't like your job, we'll just go ahead, take a hike, we'll hire somebody else. And that was a difficult thing for the National Labor Union to counter. Another group emerged about the same time called the Knights of Labor. And they took a different approach. They were trying to organize all workers. And unusual for this time, they accepted blacks and later women into their union. They sought an 8-hour day, an end to child labor, equal pay for equal work. And these were large national major goals. For the most part, they didn't make too much progress in achieving these goals. They originally did not like to strike very much because they were concerned about their union being weakened by a failed strike. And that turned out to be the problem. In the 1890s, they did lead some strikes, and when they failed, that's really the worst thing for a union. When a strike fails, workers lose faith in the union, and it's absolutely devastating. Another much more long-lasting union was the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, founded in 1886 by Samuel Gompers, and that's still around today. They combined later with the CIO, Congress of Industrial Organizations, and produced a group called the AFL-CIO. They were not so much a union in themselves as they were an association of other unions, of craft unions, skilled workers, cigar makers, electrical workers, teamsters, plumbers, etc. Now, most of these unions excluded blacks and excluded women. They were notorious for their discrimination. Their main goals were not these large national goals like an 8-hour day for everyone or anything like that. They just wanted small gains. They called it pure and simple unionism. better wages, even if they were only a little bit better, shorter hours, even if only a little bit shorter, better working conditions, and so on. The head of the AFL was Samuel Gompers, and he really didn't like capitalism, but he didn't seek to replace it. He was actually pretty moderate in his actions. His quotations are somewhat contradictory. He said, for example, it is impossible for capitalists and laborers to have common interests. Well, this presents an image of two classes strongly opposed to each other. But he also said this: the worst crime against working people is a company which fails to operate at a profit. So he saw that in order to pay their workers, companies had to be able to be profitable. Um, the most radical of all the unions was the Industrial Workers of the World, or IWW, known by everyone as the Wobblies, founded in 1905. They were socialists, they were radicals. Uh, they believed that the working class should unite against bosses. This was clearly founded on the Marxist idea of class conflict. Uh, they said an injury to one is an injury to all. They believed in one large union. And they believed, along with Karl Marx, that workers should control the means of production. By that we mean, well, if you're a farmer, you own the land, and you own the plows, for example. Those are the means or tools for producing products. Uh, in the case of a factory, that would mean the building itself, the machinery in it. They believe that workers should own these things cooperatively together, and eliminating the company altogether. They were weakened by violence against them, often on the part of the government. As soon as you declare yourself a socialist and take positions like this, especially at that time, that attracted a whole lot of opposition by some very powerful people, including in the government. They also often disagreed with each other. They had very strong opinions, and they were weakened as a result of that. Now, employers resorted to all kinds of tactics to prevent or to break unions. They would forbid union meetings. If they found that one of their workers was a union organizer, they would fire that worker right away, and they had the legal ability to do that. They demanded yellow dog contracts when anyone was hired. Now, what that is that it's an employment contract. When you are first hired, you sign a contract to work for that company, but in that contract is a promise that you will not join a union or will not promote a union. And if they found that you had violated it, you were gone immediately. And the courts later upheld the legality of these contracts. They refused to bargain collectively. Their idea was that they will deal with each worker individually. The problem is that an individual worker had no power in dealing with a huge employer like, let's say, Carnegie Steel. And most basically, they didn't give any recognition to unions. Now, recognition is a specific term when applied to labor law. It means that the company says to the union, yes, you are the bargaining agent for a whole group of workers, and we will talk to you rather than to individual workers about what wages and benefits and working conditions will be. But in order for that to happen, they have to recognize that the union is there and does represent the workers, and they never would agree to recognize the unions. Sometimes, if all else failed, they would simply resort to violence. There are some major strikes in the Gilded Age that I wanted to go into. I especially want to look at the great railroad strike of 1877. The railroads cut wages 10%, and then announced to the workers that they were going to cut them another 10%, and they increased their workload. The strikes that resulted from this were widespread and violent. Federal troops were sent to several cities by President Rutherford Hayes, and the strike was ultimately broken. In 1886 in Chicago, there was a strike against the McCormick Reaper Company. We've seen the McCormick Reapers and how important they were. Their headquarters were in Chicago. And there was a mass meeting in support of the strike and also in support of an 8-hour workday. Of course, the workdays were longer, 10 or 12 hours typically then. And at that McCormick factory, scabs fought strikers. Now, in case you're not familiar with the term scab, it's a union term for replacement worker. When workers go on strike, companies sometimes will try to hire other workers to replace the strikers. Strikers call them scabs because what they have done is wounded the company, but these other workers are covering over the wound like a scab covers over a wound. And that's the origin of the term. Police injured some of the strikers. Police and governments generally almost always took the side of the companies. Now, there was a bomb that went off at this protest meeting in Haymarket Square. And without a great deal of evidence, anarchists were charged with setting off the bomb. And there were a number of executions that resulted from this. The atmosphere was extremely polarized, extremely hostile. Thirdly, let's look at the Homestead Strike of 1892. This began when Carnegie Steel tried to cut wages by 18%. This was a time of deflation. Prices were going down, but when you cut wages so suddenly by such a large amount, there is bound to be protest, and here there certainly was. When the contract expired at the end of June 1892, the Carnegie management, led by Henry Clay Frick, locked out the workers. They closed the plant. They built a wall around it. And they tried to bring in replacement workers, scabs, and hired Pinkerton guards to escort them and to protect them. There were deaths on both sides, a tremendous amount of hostility. The Pinkertons were actually this was a private detective agency. They were actually a larger force than the United States Army was at the time. But surprisingly, they were defeated by the workers at Homestead. This is near Pittsburgh. But then the company worked with the governor, who was a political beneficiary of Andrew Carnegie, who owed Carnegie, and he called in the Pennsylvania militia, 8,500 of them, and they ultimately broke the strike. Finally, there was the Pullman Strike in 1894. George Pullman built sleeping cars in a company town west of Chicago. By company town, what that means is the company dominates the whole town. They own the housing, they own the grocery stores, they own everything. And pretty much if you wanted to work there, you had to make use of these company facilities. Now, when the Depression came in 1893, and it lasted for 4 years or so, it was known as the Depression of 1893 or the Panic of 1893, Pullman laid off a lot of workers and then cut wages 25%. That's a sudden, dramatic cut. Uh, but the rents he charged in his town and the prices he charged in his food stores were unchanged. So he was asking workers who already were not paid very well to see their wages fall by 25%, but to continue to pay Pullman the same prices they were paying before. Well, this was simply too much, and the American Railway Union called a strike. They boycotted Pullman cars all around the country. They had other railroad workers who sympathized with them, were part of their union, and they boycotted these cars. Now, the problem they ran into is that this disrupted some mail deliveries, and that made it a federal matter. Uh, and in response to that, this very, very polarized situation, President Grover Cleveland said this. He sent in federal troops, he broke the strike, and he said, if it takes the entire Army and Navy of the United States to deliver a postcard in Chicago, that card will be delivered.